Good day, everyone. My name is Vika Putri, and I am from group number 5. And as we can see in here, I'm going to present to you about Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor due to the colliding national interests. But firstly, I would like to introduce to you to our group members. So this is our group members. As I mentioned before about my name is Rafika Putri, and there are also other members, Muhammad Galih Arsya, and senior student, Kak Syifa and Kak Reinhard. And this is the table of content of the presentation. So basically, this is the content that I will present to you. Started with the introduction to national interest until the conclusion and opinion. So let's just start with the first content, which is the national interest. So, what is national interest? At the simplest way, national interest is a nation's objective, goals, or even their demands in which they are primarily concerned to protect, achieve, and preserve towards other states. And there are also interpretations, according to scholars, such as Charles and Abdul Aziz, that define national interest as the general, long-term, and continuing purpose which the state, the nation, and the government all see themselves as serving. And also, according to Morgenthau, the national interest is about survival, and it is about the protection of physical, political, and cultural identity against encroachments by other nation states. So, as a case study, we have chosen the attack on Pearl Harbor as our case study due to the direct conflict between two states that led to war with one another, where many lives are lost due to this conflicting interests. So what happened in the attack on Pearl Harbor? So the attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise military strike by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service against the U.S. Naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And as a result, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, this attack killed 2,403 U.S. personnel, including 68 civilians, and destroyed or damaged 19 U.S. Navy ships, including 8 battleships. So this attack on Pearl Harbor, seen as a big gamble for Japan, because they don't actually believe that they can win a long drawn out war with the US. So their strategy was basically like really hinged on a short war. They believe that the US probably won't have the stomach to fight this costly war against a dug in enemy thousands of miles away across the Pacific, and they would instead negotiate for peace. And allowing Japan to retain some or all of its captured territories. So, where is Pearl Harbor? Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, is located near the center of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,000 miles from the U.S. mainland and about 4,000 miles from Japan. And in addition, American intelligence officials were confident that any Japanese attack will take place in one of the relatively nearby European colonies in the South Pacific, such as the Dutch East Indies, now is Indonesia, Singapore, or Indochina. And because American military leaders were not expecting an attack so close to their home, the naval facilities at Pearl Harbor were relatively undefended. And next, who were the attackers of Pearl Harbor and when it happened? So it was started on the 26th of November 1941. A Japanese attack fleet consisting of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft started to departed from Japan and began the long journey to an assembly point 230 miles north of the Hawaiian island of Oahu. And on December 7th, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor began at 7:55 in the morning, and the entire attack took only 1 hour and 50 minutes. And the Japanese plan to give the U.S. a declaration of war before the attack began, so they would not violate the first article of the Hague Convention of 1907, which was the law and custom of war. But the fact is, the message was delayed and not relayed to U.S. official in Washington until the attack was already in progress. And then, because Japan is sort of anticipating the short war that's going to lead to negotiation and focuses on the battleships that are going to prevent the U.S. Pacific um, fleet from coming out into the Pacific and Southeast Asia and stopping the Japanese. They're not thinking about things like the fuel depots and the repair shops that are actually going to allow America to pursue a longer war in the Pacific. So, the Japan attacks on Pearl Harbor pretty much had the opposite effect of what it was hoping for, which was a negotiated peace, right? Negotiated peace and allowing Japan to retain some or all its captured territories. So, the day after the attack, which was December 8, 1941, uh, President Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech to the Congress, in which he asked for a formal declaration of war against Japan, which Congress quickly authorized. So the U.S. is officially, because of that, the U.S. is officially now in the war, given that the USA participation in the First World War is they started to like adopt an unofficial policy of non-interventionism and isolationism. And next, how was the situation during the attack? So, Pearl Harbor was assumed to be like too strongly defended to be considered a target because nobody believed that the Japanese were assaulting it by air, even if it may have been a naval attack followed by a complete invasion force or possibly sabotage. But yep, at the day it was at that day, hundreds of Japanese planes swarmed the sky, and their radial engines could be heard on Oahu. The Americans would quickly they realized how mistaken they were. When the Japanese dive bombers and fighters arrived, their initial objective were the numerous U.S. air bases that were dispersed over the island to prevent potential reprisals. Then they sank Californian and Nevada battleships. In addition, there were a lot of injured victims and men who were trapped under the deck. And a second group of Japanese planes continued the attack by attacking from the southwest. Attacks were made against the Maryland, Tennessee, and Arizona. As the second wave landed, tension rose at Pearl Harbor. Their next target was the USS Pennsylvania as well. The Japanese strikes were less organized and chaotic than the previous wave due to the heavier anti-aircraft fire. After all things were taken into account, the outcomes of the second wave were only regarded acceptable, and Pearl Harbor was awash in twisted metal, flaming oil, and the resounding cries of the injured and dying victims less than 2 hours after the initial attack. Next, it's about the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. So, by the time the people at Pearl Harbor had the change to come to terms with what had happened on December 7th, was no doubt that the aftermath of the attack would take a long time to clear right. And America had suffered amazingly at the hands of the Japanese. They're losing 2,403 U.S. personnel, including 68 civilians, and destroyed 19 U.S. Navy ships. But despite the devastation, the good news was that as soon as Japan had finished the attack, they left the recovery. They left the Hawaii, and this gave the change to the U.S., the change to the state to commence the recovery and recuperation efforts immediately. And as a result for that, the U.S. Navy went on to help win the war in the Pacific. And everyone was, of course, like everyone was terrified of a repeat attack and wanted to do what they could to prevent that kind of devastations again. So, as a result of that, the Japanese American business were boycott, and Japanese Americans who had lived in the U.S. For generations were harassed on the streets and taunted with racial insults. And also, Japanese school children were teased and bullied by boys and girls who had been their friend just like days before. Even Chinese Americans mistaken for Japanese were subjected to harassment. And as a response to that, on February 19, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066, which gave the head of the Western Defense Command the authority to relocate the Japanese people who live in the Western state to the internment camps. So, in order to combat that suspicion, many of the Japanese civilians actually joined the U.S. Military to prove their loyalty to their home. So, this led to Hawaii receiving the highest enlistment rate per capita during the war, and the story of the Japanese American Brigade is well known to this day. They become well known to this day. They fought in Europe, particularly in Italy, southern France, and Germany, and had a total of until 14,000 men served under the banner. And next, the reason of why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. So, this is the we summarize the three reason of why Japan attacked the Pearl Harbor. The first one is because the existence of Allied military installations and colonies in the Pacific, as well as American initiative to meddle in Japan's internal affairs, and because it was seen at that time that American were just merely a theoretical the neutrality of America at that time was seen as just a theoretical, and that the Americans were actively working toward Japan's imperialist ambitions. And the second is the Japan and the U.S. were clearly headed toward war when the U.S. imposed yet another harsh embargo. At that time, it is prohibiting oil export to Japan, which was high reliant on imports. And then also because it was primarily imported from the USA, the embargo severely hurt both the Japanese and war effort. And also due to the oil embargo, Japan had two choices. Whether to give in to American demands and shelve the idea of Great Japan, or seize the British Malaya and Dutch East Indies, now is Indonesia, both rich in strategic resources to become self-sufficient. And the third is Hawaii was home to the largest warship of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Pearl Harbor was viewed as the most critical and significant blow to be dealt, so it was viewed as a way to prevent the U.S. Pacific Fleet from entering the Pacific and Southeast Asia to stop the Japanese. And next is the conclusion. So, the conclusion is national interest is the objective. Each nation wishes to achieve an objective, whether it be a mutual objective or colliding objective that leads to potential short-term or even long-term conflict, driving a wedge between the two or more state relations. And in this case study of the relationship between the U.S. and Japan show us how the situation at Pearl Harbor is escalated due to the needs of their national interests. And in their conquest of achieving a Great Japan, Japan took the initiative rather than complying with U.S. embargo demands and attempted to seize the U.S. most powerful fleet in the Pacific by surprise attack. And the U.S. was unable to respond due to the war declaration that arriving later than expected. And despite the negotiation between the U.S. and Japan, Japan chose to attack the harbor and escalate the conflict to prevent the national interest from being deterred, despite knowing that the US at the time was a neutral country. And next is our opinion. So, the conflicting interest between state where military prowess is involved could lead to increase intention and a potential violent act that could be damaging to the actors. And Pearl Harbor is a start that we all can remember. A turning moment that compelled America to join a conflict because its far off Hawaiian coast had been attacked. The Japanese onslaught may be remembered more for what it caused on that tragic day in December 1941. And the true legacy of Pearl Harbor is how it forever shrank the world in terms of how Americans have seen their own national security. And the reason Japan attacked Pearl Harbor was due to the desire to increase the Japanese economy. And as oil is essential for the way of life, the oil embargo may indeed harm the Japan's economy. And therefore, on December 7th, Japan decided to attack the Pearl Harbor. And the attack on Pearl Harbor turned out to be a disastrous for its own country due to the Japan's defeat in the strategy and the supply of unequal technology used by the USA. And Japan bombarded Pearl Harbor and changed world history after 1941, which was closed with a human tragedy, namely the first and only nuclear attack in wartime. After December 7, American decision makers stopped considering this wide Pacific and Atlantic oceans as impenetrable fortresses, defending them from the country's adversaries. And to this day, nations are solving their conflicts without escalating them by finding a compromise with each other and gaining mutual benefits by cooperating with one another through negotiation and so on. But we also should consider what the December 7 attacks have wrought and how historical legacy helped shape the employment of U.S. power abroad. Wars matter not only in the past but in the present as surely as in the future. And next, so this is the sources slide of our presentations. And so yeah, that was the presentation from me. I'm sorry if there is a mistake during the presentation. Thank you for your attention and have a good day. Thank you.